So we'll pick up where we left off last class, although I'll review a bit of what we spoke about last class and then get into the brilliance of plant medicines and our biological beings and what our ancestors knew. So going back to the roots of our medicine, the traditional and indigenous views of nature as healer and first teacher as the foundation of what organizes our communities and our sense of purpose and responsibilities to one another and the more than human world, and the understanding of spirit in nature or the sentience of nature, all faced a significant challenge beginning around the 16th and 17th century, when in Western Europe, the scientific revolution emerged and reduced the image of the earth and our bodies to machines and resources to be extracted and controlled by external forces. This mechanical image and exploitative approach spread across the world, whether directly through colonization of other lands or indirectly through imperialism, the political and economic control of one country over another, but always through forced assimilation of traditional and indigenous peoples to the cultures and beliefs of the imperialists and colonialists. Some of the philosophers and scientists who laid the foundation for Western science were Francis Bacon, English philosopher often called the father of the scientific revolution. He invented the contained, controlled experiment, which would go on to become the scientific method that we use today. He spoke of binding and torturing nature's secrets out of her with, quote, the violence of impediments, end quote. He sought, quote, man's dominion over creation, end quote. René Descartes, the French philosopher who separated the mind from the body, arguing that each substance works independently from the other and laying the foundation then for the mechanical view of the body, matter also void of spirit and soul as well. And Sir Isaac Newton, English mathematician and physicist who invented 3 linear laws of motion to describe the motions of the universe. This solidified the mechanistic view of the universe, which was then applied to the earth and our bodies as well. Our bodies became machines that could be described by linear cause and effect mechanisms and understood through reductionism, which is the belief that you can understand the whole of something by breaking it down into parts and studying the parts, often in isolation. It is important to note what else was being invented or initiated during these times of the scientific revolution. Extractive capitalism, which would go on to feed into the Industrial Revolution, colonization of the Americas by Western Europe, the transatlantic slave trade, and the invention of race and racism. All of these new political, economic, and social systems were being invented at the same time as the scientific revolution, and they all intersected to support each other and to benefit those who invented them, and they still do. These systems also went on to support the rise of Western biomedicine and the colonization of traditional healing systems by Western medicine. The vast majority of us are now assimilated into the belief that the body is a machine and that the root cause of disease is likely some broken physical part inside of you, a mutated gene or a deficiency of a neurotransmitter or a malfunctioned protein. We just need to break you down, find the broken part, and then use a single target pharmaceutical drug working through linear cause and effect mechanisms, which is the most advanced gold standard method of treatment, we're told. So we went to war on disease. The military industrial complex was applied to our bodies. Medicine became targeted bullets manufactured by pharmaceutical industries that financially benefit a few, and mostly people who look like those who invented it to begin with. And I'm not saying biomedicine is bad or wrong. It has its place in time. It simply is an incomplete healing system and potentially very dangerous when it is the only system perceived to be of value and utilized universally at all times and all places, while only benefiting a minority of us. It doesn't need to be this way. Our ancestors knew other ways of knowing and healing and being in harmony with nature, community, and the more than human world in ways that brought health and healing to all and all levels of life. We need to reach back into our ancestral ways of knowing and reclaim our knowledge, Sankofa. But to understand these ways of knowing and healing, it helps to first change our metaphors. Our bodies are not machines. They are artists. Medicine was never meant to go to war with our bodies, but to dance, to poetically converse, to improvise jazz beats that bring the body back into its rhythms of health. Our ancestors knew this. Our ancestral medicines still know how to do this. Before we dive deep into our ancestral medicines and how they knew this, first let's understand what's going on in our cells on a typical healthy day. Here's an image that captures the complexity of your cellular communication processes. Each little dot is a protein in the cell, and each line between the dot represents an interaction that has happened between those proteins over a given amount of time. So if you are able to trace and map out all the proteins that are interacting in your cell over a given period of time, you can create these network graphs, they're called. Proteins are not just building blocks of muscle, as many of us think of them as, but every cell in your body contains over 100,000 unique types of proteins. And actually, there's millions of protein molecules in each cell. Proteins perform a multitude of functions in the cell, catalyzing reactions, transporting other molecules in the cell, building structures in the cell, acting as signals to communicate within and between cells. So there's hundreds of thousands of proteins interacting in each of your cells at every given moment, coordinating all the functions of your cells, including telling your cell when to divide and when not to divide. A healthy cellular environment is very adaptive. The proteins and molecules of the cell are all dynamically acting and responding to one another moment to moment to coordinate a healthy cellular environment. In the field of systems biology, we call this self-organization, the spontaneous order or coordination of the parts of a system with no single leader or top-down control or instruction manual like a genetic blueprint telling them what to do. Your genes are not directing this. Your proteins are spontaneously self-organizing. And we see self-organizing systems throughout nature and all systems of life. For example, in starlings, birds that are self-organizing in these beautiful forms that transform throughout the landscape. And there's not a single bird that's controlling that show. There's no genes directing it either. It is spontaneous self-organization when the parts come together and feel their way into meaningful form with one another. The molecules in your cells are doing the same thing every moment. Now, it's important to note, side note, systems biology is a branch of Western science that concerns itself with studying whole systems, not by breaking them down into parts and studying the parts in isolation, like the reductionist sciences of the scientific revolution. Systems biology, or sometimes called whole system science, is a science much closer in approach to how traditional and indigenous cultures approach coming to know in science, studying the whole and the relationships among the parts in order to understand the whole. System science is still not taught as a foundational science in mainstream Western biology, though it is fast becoming the leading edge of biological sciences at most major universities, and most universities have specialized departments for systems biology, especially in their departments of medicine. Western science is finally catching up to what indigenous sciences have known since their beginning. And this is one of my favorite quotes by Dr. Paul Weiss in 1964. He was one of the fathers of systems thinking or systems biology. And he's just marveling at the self-organization among the molecules in our cells. He says, since any movement or change of any one part of the system deforms the structure of the whole complex, the fact that the system as a whole tends to retain its integral configuration implies that every change of any one part affects the interactions among the rest of the population in such a way as to yield a net countervailing resultant, and this for every part. Couched in anthropomorphic language, this would signify that at all times, every part knows the stations and activities of every other part and responds to any excursions and disturbances of the collective equilibrium as if it also knew just precisely how to best maintain the integrity of the whole system in concert with the other constituents. And I just love the poetics of that. The way the molecules or the birds or our cells just seem to know how to show up moment to moment. And when another molecule or bird changes its direction, every other molecule or bird seems to know what to do in order to maintain the integrity of the whole in concert with all of the others. And so, what happens when disease processes take place in the cell? Like when cancer sets in. Of course, we know if cells start to divide when they're not supposed to divide, a tumor will develop. So what's causing that division to happen? Turns out some miscommunication among these proteins, these protein-protein interactions. Somewhere, somehow, the cell is receiving the message to divide when it shouldn't. Now, we once thought that this miscommunication was caused by a single mutated gene. Mutated genes cause cancer, we were taught. We thought that because we knew that genes code for proteins, so if the cell is receiving a message to divide when it shouldn't, it's probably because a protein is sending the wrong signal. And that protein, because it's made from a mutated gene, is probably a genetic mutation that's causing that protein to send the wrong signal. And so all we need to do is break down the communication network, find the protein that's sending the wrong signal, trace it back to its mutated gene, and then knock that gene out or suppress its expression or suppress the protein itself so that the protein would stop sending the wrong message and the cell would stop dividing. And voila, the cure for cancer. We've been at this for over 70 years. We still have not found the cure for cancer through the knocking out of single genes or proteins. It does make a lot of logical sense, though, especially in the linear logic of the mechanistic reductionist framework of biomedicine. But it turns out that mutated genes are rarely the root cause of cancer. And yes, we do find mutations in genes of cancerous cells, but it turns out that those mutations often happen after the fact in most cases. In fact, different cells taken from within the same tumor will show different sets of mutated genes. So a feedback process will happen where the breakdown in the protein-protein interactions and communication of the cell happens, and then that feeds back epigenetically into the genes, causing the genes to mutate, almost even in compensation for what the genes are encountering that the cell is doing. And the diversity of mutated genes from one cancer type to another is extraordinarily different. So cancer is not one disease traceable to the same mutated genes. Something else is breaking down at a level above the genes. And it's the communication in those networks. It's the self-organization that's breaking down. The root cause is not a single factor, not a mutated gene, but myriad of factors within and outside the cell that interferes with the ability of the molecules in the cell to self-organize. Things that interfere with healthy relationships among the parts so that they can no longer hear one another and sense one another and feel their way into those coherent forms, like Paul Weiss is speaking about. When there is interference with the relationships among the things that are necessary to give rise to self-organization, then self-organization does not take place. Disorganization sets in, and the cellular network and communication breaks down. Nonsensical messages are expressed. For example, the cell receives the message that it's time to divide when it's not. So the cell keeps dividing until a tumor grows, and diseases like cancer are the result. Mark Kirschner is the founding chair of the Department of Systems Biology at Harvard Medical School. His lab studies the way a developing embryo orchestrates numerous signals to yield the final complex organism. He writes, in the development of an organism, as in theater, timing is everything. Imagine if one night the actors in a play were to miss every single cue, delivering each line perfectly, but always a little too early or too late. The evening would be a disaster. The same is true in embryonic development. Starting at the moment when sperm and egg meet, cells in the embryo send signals to each other to coordinate the growth of organs, limbs, and tissues. Not only do the signals have to be correct, they must be perfectly timed. Otherwise, disasters like cancer results. And now another side note, another very important side note here, there is something that I find quite fascinating about both Paul Weiss's quote and Kirshner's quote. They are describing cellular processes by making metaphors to the arts. Weiss talks about the concert of the cell, this symphony in concert with one another. And Kirshner is speaking about theater. In both cases, I would add improvised. So it's like an improvised jazz concert that Paul Weiss is talking about, and maybe a bit of improvised theater where the actors are responding on the spot, moment to moment, rather than through some overly rehearsed play, but they're getting the timing right and the spacing right each moment. And when they don't, diseases like cancer sets in. So the healthy, spontaneous self-organization of the cell is like an artistry. It's like theater. It's like dance. It's like jazz that's making use of creative adaptability moment to moment. Your body is more like an artist than a machine with predetermined mechanisms. In fact, the musical nature of our biology is well known. Life is creative at all levels. Our organs and cells and molecules inside the cells are showing up moment to moment, responding to the music, while participating in making the symphony as the symphony unfolds. We are made of music, dance, rhythm, the arts, spontaneously self-organizing moment to moment. And this is true for all levels of life, from the birds all the way up to the stars, moment to moment. Your body is full of rhythmical and dynamical motions that must be perfectly timed. And that timing is not being controlled by your genes. Your cells and organs and organisms as a whole are self-organizing to the music of its being. And when each instrument, each molecule, each cell or organ and its rhythm is vibing to its highest creative potential, great symphonies emerge. Health emerges. Health is an emergent property of getting self-organization right. When your organ systems and cellular systems are not able to hear the music or feel the rhythms of each instrument, then disease sets in. Disease is an emergent property of not getting the principles of self-organization right. So now, imagine if you were to fill your cells and body with a whole bunch of white noise, like static sound everywhere. White noise, static sound everywhere. The proteins and molecules and organs would not be able to hear the music or one another very clearly. And that's what I call inflammation in the body. When your body is inflamed, it's like having white noise throughout your body. Cellular communication will break down. The environment of your cells, the cellular tissue will not be conducive to hearing the music or cues from the other cells or organs. Self-organization cannot take place. The relationships break down. The timing and spacing breaks down. Inflammation plays a key role in the pathogenesis of all chronic disease. Inflammation is one of the main drivers for the disordered communication and the breakdown of that self-organization that happens in our cells. And it turns out our bodies are inflamed. All of our bodies are quite inflamed, some more than others. And what causes inflammation? Remember when I said it's not a single thing, single root cause for cancer, but myriad of factors that causes cancer, that causes that inflammation, that white noise? Well, the standard American diet, the sedentary lifestyles we live, the toxins and environmental pollutants we are exposed to, the emotional stress we live within, the intergenerational trauma many of us inherit, industrial capitalism and financial stress, having a history of colonization and slavery, and even the dominant colonial biomedical system itself is a source of inflammation for many. And because of how all these factors intersect to affect some people more than others, some bodies are more inflamed than others. And this book here by Rupa Mara and Raj Patel outlines in great detail how our histories and current social, economic, environmental, and medical systems cause inflammation in our bodies, and why some bodies more than others are inflamed and therefore at risk of the loss of that self-organizing potential within their biological beings, and therefore at risk of chronic disease. Namely, the bodies of those of low social economic status and who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So how do we heal the chronic inflammation in our bodies so that our cells and organs and molecules can hear the music again and self-organize to heal from within? Well, we do need to decolonize all of the systems that rose out of that time of the scientific revolution and that continue to oppress us in the environment. We need to decolonize our social, political, economic, environmental, and medical systems, and that's a lot. But we can start with the decolonization of medicine and what we have agency over. And because these systems are all interconnected and influencing each other, changing one will necessarily change the others. I'm calling for a decolonization of medicine and our agency in that. Going back to our ancestral roots, our indigenous medicines. When we do that, we find a healing system that understood the music of the body, that understood the creative and adaptive self-organizing abilities of the body to heal itself and maintain its own health from within. In ancient and indigenous healing systems, medicine was not about the putting of things into the body, but using external resources to help mobilize the internal resources of the body. The body heals itself and maintains its own health. So when the systems of our bodies became imbalanced, when we could stop hearing the rhythms and the music, we knew how to use these external resources like plant medicines and drum beats and circles of ritual and dance and chanting to help stimulate the rhythms of our body back into their harmonies and self-organizing abilities. And we'll look closer at plant medicines for a moment, because plants help to restore the cellular self-organization, adaptability, and creativity of our biological beings. Plants work very differently than pharmaceutical medicines. They are not single target drugs working through suppression and control. The physical and spiritual complexity of a plant mirrors that of our own beings. The chemistry of a plant speaks the same language as the chemistry of our cells. Plants are sentient and can actually have conversations with your cells. They can help shift a cellular system or organ system back into balance, dance it back into harmony with itself and the whole of its being. We don't have to go to war with cancer. We don't have to go to war with our bodies. We can teach ourselves back into their rhythms of being. In indigenous African healing systems, plants are part of a larger integrated system of healing that includes rituals, ceremonies, divinations, and other spirit interventions that address the root cause of a person's ailment. And always these practices are aimed to restore harmony between the individual and their community, including the more than human world, which includes all the plants and animals and stars above, which then in turn translates into the kind of healing that is truly holistic, where the systems outside of us that are imbalanced and the root causes of our diseases are healed as much as the systems inside of us that are imbalanced. So our social, political, economic systems as well heal when we are practicing holistic indigenous medicines. We bring into balance all that is the root cause of our disease, outside and inside. And these healing traditions have been alive and vibrant for thousands of years in Africa, surviving colonization, imperialism, and the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, during the transatlantic slave trade, women would braid food and medicinal seed into their hair, because often they didn't even have the clothes on their back, let alone a suitcase. They would braid seed into their hair to bring to the New World, ensuring a food source and that their medicines came with them. And in her book, Working the Roots, 400 Years of a African-American Healing, Michelle Lee writes, African-American traditional medicine, like jazz and the blues, is an American classic that emerged out of the necessity of its people to survive. It began with the healing knowledge brought with the African captives on the slave ships, and later merged with Native American, traditional European, and other healing traditions to become a full-fledged body of medicinal practices that has lasted in various forms down to the present day. And I've chosen one plant medicine here that's not endemic or indigenous to Africa, but Asia, to highlight because of the way it has been studied within systems biology. And we'll bring both of these worlds together here, traditional indigenous knowledge systems with holistic Eurocentric knowledge systems. The reconciliation of both sets of knowledge systems is possible through systems biology. So curcumin is an extract from the turmeric plant, indigenous to Asia, and a very powerful anti-inflammatory medicine. And there's an image here of the protein-protein interaction networks of curcumin. So when you look at the cellular interactions, the proteins, the phytochemicals within the cells of this plant, and those interaction networks, they look very similar to the protein interaction networks within our own cells. And this is significant. This is what I mean by plants speak the same language. Plants are complex self-organizing beings just like our cells. They carry the same intelligence as our cells. So they can go in and through multiple points of contact, sometimes called multi-target drugs. I still don't enjoy the word target. Through multiple points of contact and influence, they can teach our cells back into their healthy self-organizing intelligence. They can help teach our cells and organs back into their proper rhythms, proper spacing and timing. So this plant decreases the white noise, the inflammation in our cells, and helps our cells to remember how to hear the music again, how to beat to the beat of its rhythms again. It's not just taking away the inflammation, but it's liberating the intelligence of your cells. It's helping your cells remember themselves back to their self-organizing potentials and the emergence of health. Plants are teachers inside of us as much as nature is a teacher outside of us. And in fact, in the areas of cancer care, pharmacology is looking at plant medicines once again. Most pharmaceutical drugs began from studies of plants and moved away from that, but they're coming back again. Pharmacology coming back to plants for inspiration for anti-cancer drugs, recognizing that the complex intelligence of plant medicines are required in order to heal a disease as complex as cancer. We need multi-target interventions that can go into the cell and be as adaptive and flexible as cancer itself, teaching it back into its proper forms of organization, its proper timing and spacing of those theater cues so that proper communication can take place and the cell stops dividing when it needs to stop dividing. So biomedicine is catching up with the intelligence of plants and catching up with the intelligence and brilliance of indigenous knowledge systems. In this paper, Network Pharmacology Approach for Medicinal Plants, a review and assessment, it's written, complex diseases, including cancer, diabetes, etc., draw researchers' attention because these diseases are frequently caused by a malfunction of a complete regulatory network rather than a mutation or malfunctioning of a single gene. There is an urgent need to develop innovative approaches to target the entire biological networks that underlie the disease. Traditional medicines, which are described by holistic philosophy and extensive experimentation in multi-component treatments, provide promising potential for controlling the complicated nature of disorder. Missing a space there. Identifying pharmacological targets from active ingredients of medicinal plants has become a hot topic for biomedical research to generate innovative therapies. But once again, the brilliance of our indigenous knowledge systems, our indigenous science and medicine and healing is far greater than just those plants themselves, which are brilliant beings and revolutionary forms of medicine for our current biomedical system. The current biomedical system is just touching upon, the power and potential of indigenous brilliance when it comes to healing, just opening that door to, well, let's look at plant medicines. Maybe they can give us some cues here. But there's so much more. that our ancestors knew when it came to, stimulating the self-organizing abilities of our cells and organs and organisms and spirits, our entire beings. There's so much more we use than that we called medicine. If it was drumming and dancing and nature immersions, divinations, complex coordinations of rituals and ceremonies and movements, what Malidoma Some, the West African medicine man, refers to as spirit technologies. Malidoma Some from the Dagra tribe of Burkina Faso, African shaman and medicine man. He calls it spirit technologies. Ways of coordinating complex rituals and ceremonies that work with the energy and the spirit to coordinate the spaces around and within us to influence things to happen. Like causing the rain to fall by calling in the elements and movements through ritual. Also, art making and circling and being in the elements is all medicine and traditional healing systems. The cells and molecules in our bodies respond to the movements and calls and external influences of nature's rhythms and forms and forces. And studies will show that our hearts will start beating in more resilient rhythms when surrounded by certain kinds of drum beats. Drum beats with fractal rhythms, they're called. And that's exactly the type of drum beat we find in the traditional African drum beats. It's in our bones to know this. It's been in our bones to know this since the beginning of our time. These rhythms and dances and rituals and harmonic relations of the beats of protein-protein interactions in our bodies, in our plants, in our cells, and those of the rhythms of the drums and dances and stars even have been known since the beginning of knowing. Since the beginning of knowing how to beat a drum and be in relation with nature, including our own nature, because we are nature. Nature is art, and we are nature. Our bodies are artists, not machines. And our ancestors knew this and knew how to work with the artistry of ourselves, of nature, of our beings, to mobilize that self-organizing intelligence that knows how to heal from within. And that's what it means to go back to our roots, going back to our medicine, going back to what our ancestors knew. And it is in us to know. It is in our bones to know. Ashe.